Mary Barnard never thought twice about the small tattoo on her wrist, a simple black compass rose that most people barely noticed. But when 52-year-old veteran Thomas Hayes spotted it during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday at the community center, he went completely still, his coffee cup trembling in his hands. What happened next would force an entire town to confront a truth they'd been ignoring for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Community Center buzzed with its usual Tuesday morning energy as Mary Barnard unlocked the doors at 7 a.m. sharp. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm geometric patterns across the polished wooden floors that Mary had spent countless hours maintaining. At 26, she moved through the building with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew every creaking floorboard, every temperamental light switch, every hiding spot where dust liked to collect. Mary had been the center's coordinator for 3 years, a position that sounded more impressive than it actually was. Her official duties included scheduling events, managing supplies, and keeping the 80-year-old building running smoothly. What the job description didn't mention was that she'd become the unofficial problem solver for anyone who walked through those doors. The elderly woman who couldn't figure out her smartphone, Mary would patiently walk her through it. The teenagers who needed somewhere safe to hang out after school, Mary created programs that gave them purpose. The single mothers who needed childcare during job interviews, Mary somehow made it work. But despite her 3 years of dedicated service, despite the countless lives she'd quietly improved, Mary remained largely invisible to the people who mattered. The city council saw her as little more than a glorified janitor. The community board treated her suggestions with polite dismissal. Even her salary reflected their assessment of her worth, barely enough to cover her small studio apartment 6 blocks away. The compass rose tattoo on her left wrist was equally overlooked. A simple black design, roughly the size of a quarter. It peeked out from beneath her sleeves when she reached for things. Most people assumed it was just another millennial accessory, meaningless decoration that said more about generational trends than personal significance. Mary had gotten it on her 18th birthday, right before leaving her small village in rural France to study abroad. The tattoo artist in Marseille had been an old sailor who'd spent 20 minutes explaining the historical significance of compass roses to navigation and survival. Mary had listened politely, but truthfully, she'd chosen the design because it looked elegant and understated. What people didn't know was that Mary's unassuming appearance concealed an extraordinary background. Born in the mountains of southeastern France, she'd grown up in a family where multiple languages were spoken daily. Her grandmother had been a resistance fighter during World War II, her father a humanitarian aid worker, her mother a translator for international relief organizations. Mary herself spoke 6 languages fluently and had spent 2 years working with refugee resettlement programs before taking the job at Riverside. She'd moved to this mid-sized American town specifically because it was becoming a resettlement destination for refugees from various conflict zones. Mary had hoped to continue her humanitarian work, perhaps starting programs that would help newcomers integrate into the community. Instead, she found herself managing birthday party reservations and arguing with vendors about late deliveries. The community center served a diverse population, but integration remained elusive. The longtime residents used the facility during certain hours, the recent immigrants during others, and the two groups rarely interacted beyond polite nods. Mary had proposed countless initiatives to bridge these divides: cultural exchange programs, language conversation groups, shared community gardens. Each suggestion was met with the same response: "That's not really what we do here, Mary. Let's focus on your actual responsibilities." Her actual responsibilities, it seemed, were to remain in the background and keep things running smoothly without making waves. Mary had learned to smile and nod when her ideas were dismissed, to work within the limitations others had placed on her role. But she'd never stopped preparing for the opportunity to do more. Every morning before opening the center, Mary spent an hour reading international news, keeping up with global events that affected the refugee communities she served. She maintained contact with her former colleagues in humanitarian aid, staying current on best practices for trauma-informed support and cultural integration. She'd even completed online certifications in conflict resolution and crisis intervention, paying for them with her own limited funds. Nobody asked about this additional training. Nobody seemed to notice that Mary could switch seamlessly between English, Spanish, Arabic, and French depending on who needed help. When she translated for confused visitors or mediated disputes between different community groups, it was seen as just part of her general helpfulness, not evidence of specialized skills. As Mary prepared the center for another day, arranging chairs in the main hall and checking that all the equipment was functioning properly, she had no idea that everything was about to change. In less than 2 hours, her overlooked expertise would become the difference between disaster and hope. Her meaningless tattoo would reveal connections that nobody could have imagined. And the veteran who was about to walk through those doors would see in her something that the entire community had missed. The Tuesday morning regulars began filtering into the Riverside Community Center just after 8 a.m., following patterns established over years of comfortable routine. Margaret Chun set up her senior citizens book club in the south corner, carefully arranging folding chairs in a perfect circle. The mothers' playgroup claimed the children's area, spreading colorful mats across the floor while toddlers immediately scattered toward the toy bins. In the main hall, the job seekers workshop participants arranged their materials, preparing for another session of resume writing and interview practice. Mary moved between these groups like a ghost, refilling coffee supplies, adjusting thermostats, and solving small problems before they became big ones. She exchanged pleasant greetings with the regulars, but the conversations never went deeper than discussions about room temperature or equipment issues. After 3 years, she'd learned that stepping outside her designated role made people uncomfortable. Community Center's board had made their expectations clear during Mary's last performance review 6 months ago. Patricia Hendricks, the board chairwoman, had delivered the feedback with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Mary, you're very enthusiastic about expanding your role here. But we need you to focus on facility management. When you start involving yourself in programming decisions or community outreach, it creates confusion about authority structures." The other board members had nodded in agreement. "We have qualified professionals who handle social services," added Dr. Robert Stevens, a retired university administrator who'd never actually worked directly with displaced populations. "Your job is to keep this building running, not to play social worker." Mary had tried to explain that her background in humanitarian aid gave her relevant experience, that her language skills were being underutilized, that the community had needs that weren't being met by existing programs. The response was always the same: appreciate your initiative, but stay in your lane. The unspoken truth was more complicated. Riverside had experienced significant demographic changes over the past 5 years. What had once been a predominantly white, middle-class community now included substantial populations of refugees from Somalia, Syria, and Afghanistan, as well as economic migrants from Central America. The longtime residents weren't necessarily hostile to these changes, but they weren't sure how to navigate them either. The community center had become a neutral space, where different groups could coexist without having to interact meaningfully. The board preferred this careful segregation. It avoided conflict, prevented misunderstandings, and allowed everyone to feel comfortable in their own designated times and spaces. Mary's suggestions for integration programs threatened this delicate balance. Why fix what isn't broken? Patricia had asked during one particularly frustrating board meeting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everyone gets to use the facility. We're not discriminating against anyone. Isn't that enough? Mary had wanted to point out that parallel usage wasn't the same as community building, that the isolation was creating missed opportunities for mutual support and understanding. Instead, she'd nodded and returned to her equipment inventory sheets. The most painful part of this limitation was watching opportunities slip away daily. Mary could see the elderly Somali women who attended ESL classes struggling with concepts that the volunteer teacher couldn't explain effectively. Mary spoke enough Somali to bridge that gap, but intervening would mean overstepping her bounds. She watched Syrian fathers trying to help their children with homework in subjects they couldn't understand, knowing that her Arabic skills could facilitate tutoring connections with local high school students. She observed Afghan mothers sitting alone during pickup times, isolated by language barriers that Mary could easily address. But the community center's culture was clear. Mary was support staff, not a program coordinator. Her attempts to be helpful were seen as presumptuous. When she'd once offered to translate during a particularly confusing interaction between a refugee family and a city services representative, Patricia had pulled her aside afterward. "Mary, I know you mean well, but we can't have you freelancing as an interpreter. What if you mistranslate something important? The liability issues alone could shut us down. Please stick to your assigned duties." The irony wasn't lost on Mary that her actual qualifications were being dismissed in favor of protecting the organization from her supposed incompetence. She'd worked in refugee camps where precise translation could mean the difference between life and death, where cultural mediation prevented conflicts that could turn violent. But here, her experience was seen as a liability rather than an asset. Even her appearance worked against her. At 5 feet 4 inches with a slight build, Mary looked younger than her 26 years. Her quiet demeanor and tendency to listen more than speak were interpreted as inexperience rather than professionalism. The small compass rose tattoo on her wrist was just another mark against her in the eyes of the more conservative board members, evidence of the impulsivity they associated with her generation. "We need stability in this position," Dr. Stevens had explained during her hiring interview. "Someone who understands their role and doesn't try to exceed it. This community has enough changes happening already." Mary had gotten the job not because of her qualifications, but despite them. Her humanitarian background was seen as a phase she'd grown out of. Her language skills as a nice bonus for occasional translation needs. Her cultural competency as irrelevant to the practical work of facility management. As the morning progressed, and the center filled with its usual mix of programs running in careful isolation, Mary couldn't help but notice the missed connections happening all around her. A group of Afghan women waited outside in the parking lot because they'd arrived early for their afternoon program, while the seniors book club was ending early due to low attendance. The job seekers workshop had participants struggling with online applications, while 3 rooms away, teenage volunteers from the after-school program were waiting for meaningful community service opportunities. Mary saw the solutions clearly introduce the early arrivals to the book club members who might enjoy cross-cultural conversation, connect the tech-savvy teenagers with the adults who needed computer help. But suggesting these connections would mean stepping outside her role again, risking another conversation about boundaries and appropriate behavior. So Mary continued her invisible work, maintaining the facility that housed a community that couldn't quite see itself clearly. She had no idea that in less than an hour, a war veteran would walk through those doors, carrying trauma that would shatter the careful boundaries everyone had constructed. And that when that moment came, all her overlooked expertise would suddenly become the only thing standing between breakdown and breakthrough. The compass rose on her wrist caught the morning sunlight as she reached to adjust a thermostat. black ink stark against her pale skin. Soon, that simple tattoo would reveal connections that nobody could have anticipated, transforming her from invisible support staff into the one person who could navigate the crisis about to unfold. The monthly community board meeting convened at 10 a.m. in the center's conference room, and Mary dutifully prepared the space as she had dozens of times before. She arranged chairs around the oval table, set out water glasses and notepads, and ensured the projector was working properly. As always, her role was to facilitate the meeting logistics, not participate in the discussions that would determine the center's future. Patricia Hendricks arrived first, her heels clicking authoritatively across the wooden floor as she reviewed her agenda. Dr. Stevens followed with his usual briefcase full of documentation, nodding at Mary with the distant politeness reserved for service staff. The other board members trickled in: local business owners, retired professionals, and community leaders who'd held their positions for years. "Mary will need coffee refills throughout the meeting," Patricia instructed without looking up from her papers. "And please make sure the temperature is comfortable. Last month was too warm." Mary nodded and retreated to her designated corner, where she could monitor the meeting's needs while remaining effectively invisible. She'd learned not to expect acknowledgement of the detailed reports she prepared for each meeting, documenting facility usage patterns, community feedback, and emerging needs she observed daily. The board preferred their own metrics, budget numbers, liability assessments, and complaint logs that painted a picture of the center as a successfully managed facility rather than a living community space. The meeting began with Patricia's standard review of operational matters. Maintenance costs were within budget, insurance premiums had been renewed, and the calendar was booked at satisfactory levels. Mary listened as her work was reduced to line items and statistics, her daily interactions with community members distilled into cold data points that missed the human reality entirely. Now, regarding the refugee integration workshop proposal, Patricia announced, pulling out a folder that Mary recognized with a sinking heart. 6 weeks ago, Mary had submitted a detailed proposal for a monthly program that would bring together longtime residents and recent immigrants for skills sharing and cultural exchange. She'd researched similar successful programs, outlined implementation steps, and even identified potential funding sources. Dr. Stevens has reviewed the proposal and identified several concerns, Patricia continued, not bothering to look in Mary's direction. Stevens cleared his throat importantly and opened his own folder. "While the intentions are admirable, the proposal demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of our mission here," he began. "We're a community center, not a social services agency. These kinds of integration programs require specialized training, cultural competency certifications, and professional oversight that frankly exceed our current capabilities." Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had those certifications. She had the cultural competency training. She had years of hands-on experience with exactly these kinds of programs. But she'd learned that pointing out her qualifications only made board members defensive about their own limitations. "Furthermore," Stevens continued, "there are liability concerns. What if cultural misunderstandings lead to conflicts? What if participants make complaints about discrimination or insensitive treatment? We could face lawsuits that would bankrupt this organization." Board member Janet Morrison nodded sagely. "I think Robert raises excellent points. We've been successful precisely because we don't try to bite off more than we can chew. Everyone gets equal access to our facility. Isn't that integration enough?" Mary watched as her carefully researched proposal was dismissed with the same casual indifference she'd experienced countless times before. The board didn't reject her ideas because they were bad. They rejected them because acknowledging their merit would require acknowledging her expertise, which threatened their comfortable assumption that facility management was the extent of her capabilities. "Besides," added board member Tom Richardson, "Mary's already got her hands full with her current responsibilities. We wouldn't want to overburden her with additional duties she's not trained for. The casual dismissal stung more than outright criticism would have. Richardson owned 3 local businesses and had never worked directly with displaced populations, yet his assessment of Mary's capabilities carried more weight than her actual experience. The assumption that she lacked training persisted despite her attempts to share her background during previous meetings. "What about the language barriers?" asked Morrison. "Half these refugee families don't speak English well enough for meaningful interaction. How would we even communicate effectively?" Mary bit her tongue to keep from mentioning that she spoke Arabic, Somali, Spanish, and French fluently, that she'd facilitated cross-cultural communication in far more challenging environments than a community center meeting room. But she'd learned that offering her language skills only led to patronizing responses about the difference between knowing a few words and professional interpretation. The meeting moved on to other topics: budget allocations for equipment upgrades, scheduling conflicts between user groups, and plans for the annual fundraising gala. Mary's presence became even more peripheral as the board discussed matters that directly affected the community she served daily, making decisions without input from the one person who actually interacted with those communities regularly. When the discussion turned to the upcoming visit from the State Community Development Coordinator, Mary perked up slightly. This was exactly the kind of opportunity where her background could be valuable. The coordinator would be evaluating the center's effectiveness in serving diverse populations, assessing whether state funding was being used appropriately for community integration goals. "I think we should emphasize our excellent facility maintenance and safety record," Patricia suggested. "Show them that we're good stewards of public resources." Mary could see the missed opportunity clearly. The coordinator would be looking for evidence of meaningful community engagement, programs that demonstrated successful integration and mutual support between different population groups. Simply showing clean bathrooms and balanced budgets wouldn't address the state's actual priorities. She raised her hand tentatively. "Excuse me, but I think the coordinator might be more interested in seeing—" "Thank you, Mary," Patricia interrupted. "Smoothly, but I think we can handle the strategic planning. Could you check on the coffee? It might be getting low." The dismissal was so automatic that Patricia didn't even look in Mary's direction. Mary stood and walked to the coffee station, feeling the familiar ache of being reduced to her most basic functions. Behind her, the board continued planning a presentation that would showcase their facility management while completely missing the community development goals the state actually cared about. As she refilled the coffee pot, Mary thought about the Afghan mother who'd cried in her office yesterday, overwhelmed by forms she couldn't read for services she couldn't access. She thought about the elderly Syrian man who spent hours in the center's lobby every day, not because he needed anything, but because he was lonely and it was the only place where people looked like they might understand his experience. She thought about the teenage refugees who had incredible stories and perspectives to share, but no platform to share them with their American-born peers. All of these realities existed outside the board's awareness, invisible because they happened in the spaces between scheduled programs, in the moments when Mary was just doing her job of keeping the facility running smoothly. Her proposals weren't rejected because they were impractical. They were rejected because acknowledging their necessity would require acknowledging that the board didn't really understand the community they served. The meeting ended with the usual assignments. Mary would prepare facility reports, coordinate with vendors, and handle the logistics for the coordinator's visit. Her suggestions for programming that might actually impress the state evaluator remained buried in folders, dismissed as the overreach of support staff who didn't understand the big picture. As the board members filed out, making plans for lunch, meetings, and golf games, Mary cleaned up the conference room and wondered how many more opportunities would slip away before someone finally recognized that her qualifications were exactly what the community needed. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, a crisis would force everyone to confront the gap between their assumptions and reality. Every evening after the community center closed, Mary Bernard transformed from invisible support staff into something far more purposeful. While the building settled into quiet darkness around her, she remained at her desk, working by the glow of her laptop screen on projects that no one had asked her to complete, but that she knew were essential. Tonight, like every night for the past 6 months, Mary was updating her comprehensive database of community members and their needs. The board saw attendance sheets and program enrollment numbers, but Mary saw people. She tracked which families were struggling with specific integration challenges, which individuals had skills that could benefit others, which cultural barriers were preventing meaningful connections. Amira Hassan, a 34-year-old Syrian mother, attended ESL classes but struggled with medical terminology when accompanying her diabetic son to doctor appointments. Mary had noted this and researched local medical interpretation services, identifying a volunteer program through the hospital that could help. She'd also discovered that Janet Morrison's daughter was a nursing student who needed volunteer hours and spoke basic Arabic from her college courses. Farid Amin, an Afghan engineer, spent most afternoons sitting alone in the center's lobby, clearly depressed and isolated despite his excellent English skills. Mary's research revealed that he'd designed water infrastructure systems in Kabul before fleeing the Taliban. She'd found similar projects happening at the local university's engineering department, where professors were always looking for experienced consultants for their international development courses. These connections were obvious to Mary, but they required someone to see beyond surface-level interactions to the deeper needs and assets within the community. She'd learned not to share these observations with the board, who would either dismiss them as outside her expertise or worry about the liability of facilitating relationships between community members. Instead, Mary had begun preparing comprehensive integration proposals that she planned to present when the right opportunity arose. She'd researched successful community models from other cities, identified funding sources that specifically supported cross-cultural programming, and even reached out to her former colleagues in humanitarian aid for advice on best practices. Her laptop contained folders full of detailed plans, a conversation exchange program that would pair English learners with native speakers who wanted to learn other languages, a skills-sharing initiative that would connect refugees with professional backgrounds to local mentorship opportunities, a storytelling project that would help community members share their experiences while building empathy and understanding. Each proposal was meticulously researched and professionally formatted, complete with implementation timelines, budget projections, and risk mitigation strategies. Mary had even completed additional online certifications in trauma-informed community programming and cross-cultural mediation, paying for them herself since the center's professional development budget was reserved for essential training like first aid and building maintenance. The most ambitious project was her community mapping initiative. Mary had spent weeks documenting the informal networks that already existed within the refugee populations, identifying natural leaders and support systems that could be strengthened and expanded. She'd discovered that Mrs. Chun from the book club had been an English teacher in Taiwan and would love to help with tutoring. She'd learned that several of the job seekers had entrepreneurial backgrounds and could mentor each other in small business development. But Mary's preparations went beyond program development. She'd also been quietly building relationships that the formal structure of the center didn't facilitate. During her lunch breaks, she would sit with different community members, listening to their stories and learning about their experiences. Her language skills allowed her to communicate with people who felt excluded from English-only interactions, and her background in humanitarian aid helped her recognize signs of trauma and stress that others missed. These informal connections had revealed urgent needs that weren't being addressed by existing services. Several families were struggling with immigration paperwork because they couldn't afford legal assistance. Others were underemployed despite professional qualifications, because they didn't understand how to navigate credential recognition processes. Many were dealing with mental health challenges related to their displacement experiences but couldn't access culturally appropriate counseling services. Mary had quietly begun connecting people with resources, sharing information about legal aid clinics, helping families navigate bureaucratic systems, and providing emotional support to individuals who had no other outlets. She was careful to do this work outside the center's official programming, meeting people at coffee shops or in their homes to avoid questions about overstepping her role. The compass rose tattoo on her wrist had become a sort of calling card among the refugee community. Several people had asked about its meaning, and Mary had shared the story of how her grandmother had given her the design, a symbol of guidance and safe passage that had protected their family during their own displacement experiences decades earlier. She'd never mentioned this personal history to the board, knowing they would either dismiss it as irrelevant or worry about her emotional investment in the work. But for the families she served informally, the tattoo represented someone who understood their journey. It marked her as someone who had family stories of displacement and resilience, someone who chose symbols of navigation and survival, not as fashion statements, but as reminders of where she came from and where she was going. Mary's evening preparation sessions also included staying current with international news, particularly developments in Somalia, Syria, and Afghanistan that affected the family she worked with. She subscribed to humanitarian aid newsletters, followed refugee advocacy organizations on social media, and maintained contact with former colleagues who could provide insights into emerging challenges and best practices. This knowledge allowed her to anticipate needs before they became crises. When political developments in Afghanistan led to increased anxiety among the Afghan community members, Mary was prepared with information about legal protections and emotional support resources. When changes in federal immigration policy created confusion about documentation requirements, she had already researched the implications and identified appropriate assistance programs. The board remained unaware of this extensive preparation because Mary had learned to keep her expertise hidden. Her suggestions were more likely to be accepted if they seemed to emerge naturally from immediate circumstances rather than from comprehensive planning and research. So she waited, prepared for opportunities that might never come, building skills and knowledge that might never be officially recognized. As Mary worked late into the evening, cross-referencing community needs with available resources and developing new program proposals that might someday see the light of day, she had no idea how soon her hidden preparation would become essential. Tomorrow would bring a crisis that would strip away all the careful boundaries and polite dismissals, revealing the urgent need for exactly the kind of expertise she'd been quietly developing. The compass rose tattoo caught the lamplight as she typed, its simple design carrying weight that no one could have imagined. Soon, that symbol would become the key to unlocking not just her hidden qualifications, but a truth about connection and survival that would transform how an entire community understood itself. Thomas Hayes had been coming to the Riverside Community Center for exactly 3 weeks, drawn by the veteran support group that met every Wednesday morning. At 52, the former Marine carried himself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to navigate civilian spaces without drawing attention to the battles still fighting in his head. He preferred arriving early, when the center was less crowded and the noise levels were manageable. This Tuesday morning felt different from the moment he stepped through the front doors. The main hall buzzed with unusual activity, multiple groups setting up simultaneously instead of the carefully scheduled rotation he'd grown accustomed to. A family crisis had forced the rescheduling of 3 programs into the same time slot, and the center's neat compartmentalization was collapsing into chaotic overlap. Mary Bernard moved through the confusion with practiced efficiency, trying to accommodate everyone's needs in the limited space. She'd arrived at 6 a.m. to reconfigure the room layouts, but the mathematics of fitting 3 groups into 2 available spaces remained problematic. The seniors' book club needed quiet. The toddler playgroup required open floor space. The ESL class needed wall access for their visual aids. Thomas found a corner chair where he could observe without participating, a habit developed over months of adjustment to civilian gathering spaces. The veterans group wouldn't start for another hour, but he preferred the predictability of arriving early to the anxiety of walking into a room full of ongoing activity. His coffee cup sat untouched on the side table as he watched Mary orchestrate the logistics with calm competence. The first sign of trouble came from the ESL classroom, where frustrated voices began rising above the conversational hum. Thomas recognized the sound, not anger, but the kind of distress that came from communication breaking down under pressure. He'd heard it in military contexts when critical information couldn't be transmitted clearly, when lives depended on understanding. That wasn't happening. Mary had been helping the book club relocate when the crisis escalated. Through the doorway, Thomas could see an elderly Afghan man gesticulating frantically at a younger woman who was clearly struggling to understand him. The ESL instructor, a well-meaning volunteer named Sandra, stood between them looking helpless. As the situation deteriorated, "I think he's saying something about his wife," Sandra called out desperately. "But I can't understand. His English isn't clear when he's upset, and I don't speak whatever language he's speaking." Other class members were becoming agitated, some trying to help translate while others backed away from the growing commotion. The careful calm of the center's morning routine was fracturing as multiple conversations erupted in different languages, with Sandra attempting to moderate discussions she couldn't follow. Thomas watched Mary pause in her book club assistance, her attention drawn to the crisis unfolding in the next room. Her body language changed, shoulders straightening, head tilting slightly as she listened to the rapid mix of languages coming from the classroom. For just a moment, her usual background presence shifted into something more focused, more purposeful. But before Mary could respond, Patricia Hendricks arrived for an unscheduled visit, her heels clicking across the wooden floor with authority. She surveyed the chaotic scene with the kind of disapproval that Thomas recognized from military inspections, the look of someone finding exactly the disorder they'd expected to discover. "What's happening here?" Patricia demanded, her voice cutting through the multilingual conversations. "Why are there so many people in one space? Where's the proper supervision?" Mary turned from the book club setup, her professional composure intact despite the stress evident in her eyes. "We had to reschedule several programs due to a family emergency with one of our volunteers. I've been working to accommodate everyone, but we're dealing with some communication challenges in the ESL class." Communication challenges? Patricia's tone suggested this was somehow Mary's fault. "These programs are supposed to be managed by qualified instructors. Where's the professional oversight?" The Afghan man's voice rose again from the classroom, now clearly distressed. Thomas could hear the desperation in it, the kind of urgency that transcended language barriers. Other voices joined in, some trying to help, others expressing their own frustration with the growing chaos. "I need to help them," Mary said, taking a step toward the classroom. "Absolutely not," Patricia snapped. "You're not qualified to handle this kind of situation. We need to call the proper authorities, social services, maybe the police if this gets out of hand." Thomas felt his chest tighten. The suggestion of calling police for what was clearly a communication breakdown rather than a security threat triggered memories of military operations where similar misunderstandings had escalated into violence. He watched Mary's face as she processed Patricia's response, saw the moment when professional deference warred with human compassion. "Ma'am, I don't think we need to involve law enforcement," Mary said carefully. This appears to be a family concern that just needs proper translation. If I could just... You could just what? Patricia interrupted. You're facility management, not a social worker. We have protocols for these situations, and they don't involve untrained staff getting involved in cultural conflicts they don't understand. The irony of Patricia's statement wasn't lost on Thomas. From his corner observation post, he could see that Mary clearly did understand what was happening. While Patricia's protocols were about to escalate a resolvable communication problem into a genuine crisis, the Afghan man appeared in the classroom doorway, his face etched with worry as he looked around the center desperately. His eyes found Mary, and he spoke rapidly in what Thomas recognized as Dari, gesturing urgently toward the parking lot. Mary's expression shifted as she listened, her body language indicating comprehension. He's saying his wife collapsed in there. Car, Mary translated automatically, then caught herself as Patricia's face darkened with disapproval. How do you know what he's saying? Patricia demanded. Are you making assumptions, or do you actually speak? Whatever that was, the question hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas could see Mary calculating the cost of revealing her qualifications against the cost of letting a medical emergency go unaddressed. In that moment of hesitation, he recognized something familiar, the look of someone whose expertise was being dismissed by people who should know better. The Afghan man spoke again, more urgently, pointing toward the parking lot where a woman could be seen slumped in the passenger seat of a small sedan. The situation was deteriorating rapidly while Patricia insisted on protocols, and Mary wrestled with the boundaries that had been placed around her role. Thomas set down his coffee cup and stood up. Military training had taught him to recognize moments when standard procedures became obstacles to necessary action. This was one of those moments. And something about Mary's careful restraint, her obvious competence being held in check by bureaucratic limitations, reminded him of every capable soldier he'd ever seen constrained by incompetent leadership. The crisis was about to force everyone in that room to confront the difference between following rules and solving problems. And Thomas had a feeling that the young woman they'd all been underestimating was about to become the only thing standing between chaos and resolution. Patricia Hendricks stood at the center of the growing chaos like a fortress of administrative authority, her clipboard clutched against her chest, as if documentation could solve the crisis unfolding around her. The Afghan man continued his urgent appeals in Dari, his wife visible through the glass doors slumped in their car, while Patricia insisted on following procedures that were completely inadequate for the emergency at hand. We need to call 911, Patricia announced loudly, pulling out her phone with the decisive air of someone taking charge. This is a medical emergency, and we're not equipped to handle medical emergencies. Everyone needs to step back and let the professionals handle this. Mary watched in growing frustration as Patricia began dialing, knowing that emergency responders would face the same communication barriers that were preventing effective help right now. The Afghan man was trying to explain something, crucial information that could be vital for the paramedics, but no one except Mary could understand him. Ma'am, Mary said, stepping forward with careful respect, I understand what he's saying. His wife is diabetic, and he thinks she's having a severe hypoglycemic episode. He has medication in the car, but he's not sure about the dosage because their doctor's instructions were in English. And stop right there, Patricia interrupted sharply. You are not qualified to make medical assessments or provide medical advice. You're a facility coordinator, not a doctor or a nurse or a translator. Dr. Stevens had arrived during the commotion, drawn by the raised voices and visible through the glass doors. He approached Patricia with the measured stride of someone accustomed to being the voice of reason in crisis situations. What's the situation here? He asked, surveying the scene with the analytical eye of a retired administrator who preferred problems that could be solved with proper categorization and referral. Medical emergency, Patricia replied efficiently. Facility staff overstepping. Boundaries. I've called 911, and we need to clear the area of unauthorized personnel. Stevens nodded approvingly, then noticed Mary standing nearby with obvious tension in her posture. Miss Bernard, isn't it? I think it would be best if you return to your regular duties and let the board handle this situation. We don't want any liability issues if well-meaning but unqualified staff attempt to provide assistance they're not trained for. The dismissal was delivered with polite finality, the kind of bureaucratic courtesy that brooked no argument. Thomas Hayes watched from his corner position as Mary's face flushed with barely contained frustration. He could see her fighting between professional obedience and human urgency, knowing she had the skills to help but being systematically prevented from using them. Dr. Stevens, Mary said, her voice carefully controlled, I have training in humanitarian aid and crisis intervention. I speak Dari fluently, and I understand what the gentleman is trying to explain about his wife's condition. The paramedics are going to need that information when they arrive. Stevens exchanged a look with Patricia that spoke volumes about their assessment of Mary's presumption. Miss Bernard, I'm sure you mean well, but there's a significant difference between casual language knowledge and professional medical interpretation. We can't risk miscommunication in a life-threatening situation. The Afghan man had moved to the doors, gesturing frantically between his wife and the group of officials who were clearly in charge, but couldn't understand his increasingly desperate explanations. Other ESL class members had gathered around, some trying to help translate, but lacking the medical vocabulary needed for accurate communication. Besides, Patricia added, your job description is quite clear about the scope of your responsibilities. When you start acting outside that scope, it creates confusion about authority and accountability. What if something goes wrong? What if your interpretation is incorrect? The liability exposure could destroy this organization. Thomas felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same frustration he'd experienced in military situations where bureaucratic caution prevented effective action. He'd seen good soldiers sidelined by commanders who prioritized cover-your-ass protocols over mission success, who would rather fail safely than risk succeeding outside established procedures. Mary looked toward the parking lot where the woman remained unconscious in the car, then back at Patricia and Stevens, who were discussing the proper chain of command for emergency situations while precious minutes ticked away. The Afghan man had stopped trying to communicate with the officials and was now talking rapidly to other community members, his desperation evident in every gesture. I need to help them, Mary said quietly, more to herself than to the board members, who had already dismissed her input. No, you need to do your job, Patricia replied firmly. Your job is facility management. When you try to expand beyond that role, you create exactly the kind of chaotic situation we're dealing with now. If you had proper boundaries, none of this confusion would be happening. The accusation was breathtakingly unfair, blaming Mary for a crisis she was trying to resolve rather than acknowledging that her suppressed expertise was exactly what the situation required. Thomas watched her absorb the criticism with the kind of resigned acceptance that spoke of repeated similar encounters. Dr. Stevens checked his watch with the air of someone managing a schedule rather than a human emergency. The paramedics should be here shortly. Miss Bernard, perhaps you could ensure that the entrance is clear for emergency vehicles and that any unnecessary observers are moved to appropriate distances. The instruction was delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance, reducing Mary to traffic control while the real decisions were made by people who lacked the qualifications to make them. Thomas could see Mary's internal struggle, the pull between the obedience that had kept her employed and the knowledge that following orders meant watching someone suffer unnecessarily. Ma'am, Mary tried one more time, the medication he's talking about, insulin versus glucose, makes a crucial difference in treatment. If I could just explain to him how to communicate that information clearly when the paramedics arrive. That's enough. Patricia snapped. You're not listening, Miss Bernard. You are not qualified for medical interpretation. You are not trained in emergency response. You are not authorized to provide advice that could affect someone's health and safety. End of discussion. The finality in Patricia's voice carried the weight of employment consequences. Mary had been given a direct order to stay in her lane, with the clear implication that continued advocacy would be considered insubordination. Thomas recognized the moment when a capable person was forced to choose between their job and their conscience. The sound of approaching sirens provided a temporary reprieve, but Thomas could see that the fundamental problem remained unresolved. The paramedics would arrive to find a communication barrier that Mary could easily bridge, but she'd been explicitly forbidden from providing that assistance. The very expertise that could prevent a tragedy was being suppressed by people who prioritized bureaucratic control over human welfare. As emergency vehicles pulled into the parking lot, Mary stepped back from the group of officials with the defeated posture of someone who'd been systematically prevented from helping. Her hands clenched at her sides, and Thomas noticed how the compass rose tattoo on her wrist seemed to stand out against her pale skin, a symbol of navigation and guidance that was being ignored by everyone who should have recognized its significance. Crisis was about to reach its breaking point, and the people in charge had just ensured that the one person who could help navigate it safely would be forced to watch from the sidelines. Thomas had seen enough incompetent leadership to recognize it when it appeared, and he was beginning to understand that Mary Bernard was exactly the kind of person who deserved better from the institutions she served, but he had no idea that his own trauma was about to collide with her suppressed expertise in a way that would force everyone to confront the cost of dismissing people whose qualifications didn't fit convenient assumptions about their roles. Mary Bernard stood frozen in the center hallway, watching through the glass doors as paramedics approached the unconscious woman in the car, while the Afghan man gestured frantically, trying to communicate critical medical information they couldn't understand. Patricia Hendricks and Dr. Stevens had positioned themselves as intermediaries, creating a barrier between Mary and the emergency that their protocols were making worse by the minute. The sound of the sirens had triggered something in Thomas Hayes. His hands began trembling slightly as memories of convoy attacks and medical evacuations flooded back moments when communication failures had meant the difference between soldiers living and dying. He watched the scene unfolding with growing recognition that bureaucratic incompetence was about to cause preventable harm. Mary's internal war was visible in every line of her body. She'd spent 3 years following orders, staying in her lane, accepting limitations that others had placed on her expertise. But she could see exactly what was happening. The paramedics were trying to assess the woman's condition while her husband desperately attempted to explain her medical history in a language they didn't understand. Critical minutes were being lost to translation barriers that Mary could eliminate with a single conversation. "I can't just stand here," Mary whispered to herself, taking the step toward the doors. "Miss Bernard," Patricia's voice cut through the air like a whip. "I meant what I said. Return to your duties immediately, or we'll need to discuss your future employment here." The threat was crystal clear. Helping could cost Mary her job, her income, her ability to serve the community she'd quietly supported for years. But watching someone suffer while she possessed the exact skills to help was becoming unbearable. Thomas saw the moment Mary made her decision. Her shoulders straightened, her jaw set with determination, and she moved toward the doors with the purposeful stride of someone choosing conscience over compliance. In that instant, she transformed from invisible support staff into someone taking command of a situation that everyone else was failing to handle. "Mary, don't," called Sandra from the ESL classroom, recognizing the career-ending nature of what was about to happen. But Mary was already pushing through the doors. approaching the cluster of paramedics and family members with the calm authority of someone who'd navigated far more challenging crises in refugee camps and humanitarian aid contexts. Her 3 years of suppressed expertise suddenly became visible as she shifted into professional mode. "Excuse me," she said to the lead paramedic, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who belonged in this conversation. "I speak Dari and can translate for the family. The gentleman has been trying to explain that his wife is diabetic and may be experiencing severe hypoglycemia." The paramedic looked up with obvious relief. "Thank God. We've been trying to get medical history for 5 minutes. Can you ask him about her medications, when she last ate, any recent changes in her routine?" Mary turned to the Afghan man and spoke in rapid, fluent Dari. Thomas watched through the window as the man's face transformed with relief and gratitude. Finally, someone could understand him. The conversation flowed quickly, with Mary asking detailed medical questions and translating the responses with professional precision. Behind Mary, Patricia and Dr. Stevens had followed her outside, their faces dark with anger at her blatant insubordination. "Miss Bernard, step away from this situation immediately," Patricia commanded. "You are not authorized to provide medical interpretation services." Mary didn't turn around. She continued her conversation with the family, gathering critical information about insulin schedules, recent stress factors, and symptoms that had preceded the collapse. The paramedics worked more efficiently with accurate information, their assessment and treatment becoming focused and effective. "This is gross misconduct," Dr. Stevens declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Bernard, you are officially suspended pending a disciplinary review. Remove yourself from this property immediately." Thomas felt his chest tighten as he watched Mary absorb the consequences of her choice. She'd known this would happen, had calculated the cost, and decided that saving someone's life was worth losing her job. The quiet courage of that decision reminded him of every soldier who'd ever put mission success above personal safety. But Mary still didn't stop translating. The woman in the car was beginning to respond to treatment, her husband weeping with relief as the paramedics stabilized her condition. Mary coordinated the transfer to the ambulance, ensuring that critical medical information would accompany the patient to the hospital. Only when the ambulance doors closed and the emergency vehicles pulled away did Mary turn to face Patricia and Dr. Stevens. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as if the weight of 3 years of suppressed competence had finally lifted from her shoulders. "I understand that I'm suspended," she said quietly. "But that woman is going to survive because she received appropriate treatment based on accurate medical history. That was worth any consequence you want to impose." Patricia's face was rigid with fury. "Pack your personal belongings and leave the premises. Security will escort you out." Thomas watched Mary walk back into the center with dignity intact, her small frame somehow commanding more respect than the officials who just fired her for being too competent for their comfort. As she collected her items from the desk she'd occupied for 3 years, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The compass rose tattoo on her wrist. Simple black lines forming a navigation symbol that Thomas recognized from his own military service. But this version was different. More detailed, more specific. As Mary reached for her laptop bag, the tattoo caught the light, and Thomas saw additional elements he'd missed before, tiny markings around the compass points that he'd seen only once before, on the arm of a French resistance fighter who'd saved his unit during a covert operation in Syria. The tattoo wasn't just a compass rose. It was a specific symbol used by underground networks that help people navigate dangerous territory, a mark of belonging to a community that understood survival and sacrifice in ways that most people never would. Thomas's coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor as the full implications hit him. Mary Bernard wasn't just a facility coordinator with language skills. She was connected to something much deeper, much more significant than anyone had realized. And they just fired her for using exactly the expertise that made her invaluable. Thomas Hayes sat in stunned silence as Mary packed her belongings with quiet efficiency, her movements calm despite having just lost her job for doing the right thing. The shattered coffee cup at his feet seemed like a small catastrophe compared to what he'd just witnessed, not just the firing of a competent person, but the systematic dismissal of someone whose background clearly went far deeper than anyone understood. The compass rose tattoo haunted him. He'd seen that exact design once before, in circumstances that had saved his life and the lives of his entire unit. The memory was sharp despite the years. A French woman named Celeste, who'd guided them through territory controlled by hostile forces, her arm bearing an identical mark that identified her as part of a network that helped people escape dangerous situations. Underground railways, she'd called them in her accented English. Paths that exist for those who need safe passage when official channels fail. Mary finished packing her laptop and personal items into a worn leather bag, her professional composure intact even as Patricia Hendricks watched her every move with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally eliminated a troublesome element. The board members seemed to view her departure as a return to proper order, not recognizing they'd just lost the one person who actually understood the community they claimed to serve. As Mary headed toward the exit, Thomas made a decision that surprised him. Military training had taught him to recognize assets when he saw them, and everything about Mary's response to the crisis screamed specialized training that went far beyond facility management. Her language skills, her calm under pressure, her willingness to sacrifice her position for strangers, these weren't random qualities but indicators of someone with a very specific background. "Miss Bernard," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Mary paused near the door, turning with the polite attention she'd shown everyone despite being treated poorly by most. Up close, Thomas could see the compass rose more clearly, definitely the same design he remembered, complete with the small navigational markers that meant something specific to people who understood their significance. "Yes, sir," Mary replied, her professionalism intact despite everything that had just happened. Thomas glanced around the center, noting that Patricia and Dr. Stevens were engaged in animated discussion about damage control and liability management. The other community members had dispersed, leaving the main area relatively private for conversation. "That tattoo," Thomas said quietly, nodding toward her wrist. "Where did you get it?" Mary's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "It's a family design. Why do you ask?" "Because I've seen it before," Thomas replied, his voice dropping lower. "In Syria, 2018. A woman named Celeste had the same mark. She saved my unit when we were trapped behind enemy lines." The change in Mary's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her casual politeness transformed into sharp attention, her eyes scanning Thomas's face with the kind of assessment that spoke of training in reading people quickly and accurately. "What unit?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marine Force Reconnaissance. We were extracting a humanitarian aid worker when our exfil route was compromised. Celeste appeared out of nowhere with local contacts and alternate routes that got us to safety." Mary was quiet for a long moment, processing information that Thomas could see meant something significant to her. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Celeste Moreau was my grandmother's sister," she said quietly. "The compass rose is our family symbol. It marks people who help others find safe passage when they're lost or in danger." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd wondered how a facility coordinator had acquired such obviously advanced skills in crisis management and cross-cultural communication. Now he understood. Mary wasn't just someone with humanitarian experience. She was part of a family legacy of helping people escape dangerous situations, carrying on work that had saved countless lives across generations. "Your grandmother," Thomas said, pieces clicking into place. "Was she resistance during the war?" Mary nodded. "Simone Bernard. She helped Allied personnel and refugees navigate occupied territory." The compass rose was how resistance networks identified each other, people who could be trusted to provide guidance when official systems failed. Thomas looked around the community center with new understanding. Mary hadn't just been doing facility management for 3 years. She'd been continuing her family's work, helping displaced people navigate systems that weren't designed for their success, providing guidance that went far beyond what any job description could contain. "And now they've fired you for being too good at it," Thomas said, anger building at the bureaucratic stupidity he'd just witnessed. "They fired me for insubordination," Mary corrected. "But yes, essentially for using skills they didn't want me to have." Thomas made another decision, this one feeling as natural as breathing. "What if I told you there's another way to help these people? A way that doesn't require board approval or staying within arbitrary boundaries?" Mary's expression became very still, very focused. "I would ask what you have in mind." "There are resources available for veterans who want to support refugee communities. Federal grants, private foundations, organizations that work outside traditional channels. People who understand that sometimes the best help comes from those who've been in similar situations." Thomas had been researching these possibilities for months, looking for ways to contribute meaningfully to communities that reminded him of places he'd served overseas. He discovered networks of veterans who worked with refugee organizations, providing everything from translation services to advocacy support, to informal guidance through bureaucratic systems. "What would that look like?" Mary asked. "It would look like you doing exactly what you just did, using your actual qualifications to help people navigate systems that aren't designed for their success. But instead of asking permission from people who don't understand the work, you'd be part of networks that do." Mary was quiet for another moment, her fingers absently touching the compass rose on her wrist. Thomas could see her processing possibilities that the community center board had never allowed her to consider. "There's a meeting tomorrow night," Thomas continued. "Veterans and community advocates working on refugee support initiatives. People who believe that expertise matters more than credentials, that helping people is more important than following procedures that don't work." "And you think I should come to this meeting?" Mary said. "I think you should lead it," Thomas replied. "Because from what I just saw, you're exactly the kind of person these communities need, someone who understands that safe passage sometimes requires going around obstacles rather than through them." Mary shouldered her bag and looked back at the community center where Patricia and Dr. Stevens were still congratulating themselves on maintaining proper boundaries. When she turned back to Thomas, her expression had transformed completely. The invisible support staff was gone, replaced by someone who just remembered exactly who she was and what she was capable of. "Text me the details," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority. "It's time to stop asking permission to do work that needs to be done." The meeting took place in a converted warehouse space that Thomas Hayes had secured through veteran advocacy networks, far from the bureaucratic oversight that had constrained Mary's work at the community center. When Mary arrived at 7 p.m. on Wednesday evening, she found herself in a room filled with people who understood crisis response, from the ground-level veterans, humanitarian aid workers, refugee community leaders, and social advocates who'd learned to work outside traditional institutional frameworks. Thomas introduced her simply, Mary Bernard, recently fired from the Riverside Community Center for being too competent for their comfort. Her grandmother was Simone Bernard of the French Resistance, and she carries on the family tradition of helping people find safe passage when official channels fail. The introduction carried weight that Mary hadn't expected. Several people in the room recognized her grandmother's name. Others nodded with the understanding of people who'd worked in similar networks. Within minutes, Mary found herself in conversations that assumed her expertise rather than questioning it, discussions that built on her knowledge rather than dismissing it. We've been trying to establish better connections between refugee families and local support services, explained Dr. Sarah Chun, a psychologist who specialized in trauma-informed community programs. But we keep running into the same institutional barriers: organizations that want to help but don't understand the cultural competencies required for effective assistance. Mary pulled out her laptop and opened the comprehensive database she'd been developing during her evenings at the community center. I've been tracking exactly those needs, she said, sharing her screen with the group. Families struggling with specific integration challenges, individuals with professional skills that aren't being utilized, natural community leaders who could facilitate programs if they had appropriate support. The room fell quiet as people absorbed the scope and detail of Mary's work. Her database contained not just names and contact information, but detailed assessments of needs, assets, and potential connections that could transform how refugee services operated in their city. "This is extraordinary," said Marcus Williams, a veteran who coordinated employment programs for displaced people. "This is exactly the kind of community mapping that effective integration requires. How long did this take you to develop?" 3 years, Mary replied. "I worked on it after hours, building relationships and documenting needs that weren't being addressed by existing programs. The community center board saw it as overreach. I saw it as doing my job properly." Thomas watched the room's reaction with satisfaction. These were people who recognized competence when they saw it, who understood that effective community work required exactly the kind of comprehensive preparation that Mary had been doing in isolation. "What about language capacity?" asked Alina Rodriguez, who coordinated legal aid services. "We're constantly struggling with interpretation needs that go beyond basic conversation into specialized areas like medical terminology, legal concepts, bureaucratic procedures." Mary switched to another section of her database. "I speak 6 languages fluently and have specialized vocabulary in humanitarian aid, medical interpretation, and legal assistance. I've been doing informal translation for 3 years, but always had to be careful not to exceed my authorized role." "Authorized by whom?" asked Dr. Chun with obvious incredulity. "People who spoke one language and had never worked directly with displaced populations," Mary replied. "They were convinced that good intentions were more important than actual qualifications." The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of what had been lost when the community center fired Mary: her language skills, her cultural competency, her comprehensive understanding of community needs, her family history of resistance. Work, all of it had been dismissed as irrelevant to facility management, while being desperately needed for effective community development. "Here's what I don't understand," said Marcus. "You clearly have professional-level qualifications in humanitarian aid and community development. Why were you working as a facility coordinator?" Mary's answer revealed another layer of institutional failure. "Because that was the only position available when I moved here. I applied for community outreach roles, program coordinator positions, refugee services jobs. Every organization wanted someone with local experience, even though my international background was directly relevant to the populations they served." "So you took the facility job as a way to get local experience," Dr. Chun concluded, "and spent 3 years proving that local experience isn't the same thing as cultural competency," Mary replied. "But by then, everyone had categorized me as support staff, suggesting that I might be qualified for something else." Threatened people who'd already decided what I was capable of. Thomas had been watching the group's reaction with growing anger at the waste of talent he was witnessing. Today, they fired her for saving someone's life. A diabetic woman whose husband couldn't communicate her medical history to paramedics. Mary provided critical translation that enabled proper treatment, and the board suspended her for exceeding her authority. The room erupted in outraged conversations as people processed the implications of what Thomas had described. These were individuals who'd worked in crisis situations where competence mattered more than credentials, where lives depended on people using whatever skills were necessary regardless of their official roles. "That's criminal negligence," declared Elena. "They prevented effective emergency response to protect bureaucratic boundaries." "It's also exactly the kind of institutional barrier that keeps communities isolated," added Dr. Chun. "When organizations prioritize procedures over people, they create the very problems they claim to want to solve." Mary felt something shifting inside her as she listened to the discussion. For 3 years, she'd been made to feel that her expertise was presumptuous, that her preparations were excessive, that her qualifications were irrelevant. Now she was surrounded by people who understood that effective community work required exactly the kind of comprehensive approach she'd been developing. "What would it look like," asked Marcus, "if we supported Mary in doing this work the right way? Without institutional constraints, with proper resources, as part of networks that actually understand the mission?" The question opened up possibilities that Mary had stopped allowing herself to imagine. Working with people who recognized her qualifications, using her skills without having to justify their relevance, serving communities without having to navigate bureaucratic gatekeepers who didn't understand the work. "It would look like community development that actually develops communities," Mary replied. "Integration programs that integrate, support services that support, and crisis response that responds effectively instead of just following procedures." Thomas smiled as he watched Mary step fully into her expertise for the first time in years. The invisible support staff had been replaced by the humanitarian aid professional she'd always been. Finally working with people who could see her clearly, the compass rose on her wrist caught, the overhead light as she gestured while speaking, no longer a meaningless decoration, but a symbol of guidance that was about to be properly utilized. The room full of advocates and veterans had just discovered exactly the kind of leader they'd been looking for, and Mary had just rediscovered exactly who she was meant to be. Within 48 hours of the warehouse meeting, Mary Bernard had transformed from unemployed facility coordinator to the central coordinator of the most comprehensive refugee support initiative their city had ever seen. Working from a donated office space and supported by the Veteran Advocacy Network, she was finally able to implement the programs she'd been developing for 3 years. The first test came when the Riverside Community Center called her on Friday morning. Patricia Hendrick's voice was strained with barely controlled desperation as she explained the crisis they were facing without Mary's presence. "We have the State Community Development Coordinator arriving on Monday for our evaluation," Patricia sighed, her usual authoritative tone replaced by something approaching panic. "The ESL classes are in chaos without proper translation support. We have 3 families dealing with bureaucratic issues we can't help them navigate, and Dr. Stevens just realized that all the community integration proposals were yours, not ours." Mary listened with professional courtesy while feeling a satisfaction she'd never allowed herself to experience during her employment. "I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulties," she replied neutrally. "Look, Mary, we made some mistakes." Patricia continued, the admission clearly painful. "We may have been too hasty in our response to the emergency situation. Perhaps we could discuss the possibility of you returning, maybe with expanded responsibilities that better utilize your background." "I appreciate the offer," Mary said, "but I'm no longer available for that position. I'm now working as Regional Community Integration Coordinator for the Veterans Refugee Support Initiative, and my responsibilities extend far beyond single facility management." The silence on the other end was lengthy. When Patricia spoke again, her voice carried the recognition that the community center had lost something irreplaceable. "What does that mean for our evaluation?" "The coordinator is specifically looking for evidence of successful integration programming, and without your proposals, Mary could have taken satisfaction in the community center's predicament, but her professional training focused on solutions rather than retribution. I'd be happy to provide consultation services for your evaluation. My fee is $150 per hour for program assessment and development. The conversation that followed established Mary as an external consultant to the organization that had fired her 3 days earlier. But more importantly, it demonstrated her transformation from dismissed support staff to recognized expert, whose services were now valued enough to be purchased. The state coordinator's visit on Monday showcased exactly what effective community development looked like when led by someone with appropriate qualifications. Mary had spent the weekend coordinating with her new network to create programming that the community center could never have imagined. The evaluation began with a demonstration of the integrated language exchange program Mary had designed, where refugee families shared cultural traditions with longtime residents, while both groups practiced conversation skills. The Afghan man whose wife Mary had helped translate for served as one of the cultural ambassadors, telling his story with dignity and pride rather than desperation. "This is remarkable," the state coordinator told Mary as they observed a session where a Syrian engineer was mentoring local high school students in advanced mathematics while they helped him navigate professional certification requirements. This level of mutual support and skill sharing represents exactly the kind of community integration that our funding is designed to promote. Mary guided the coordinator through multiple program examples that demonstrated her comprehensive approach to community development. The crisis intervention protocol she'd established ensured that language barriers never again prevented effective emergency response. The cultural competency training she provided helped local service providers understand the populations they served. The skills inventory she developed connected refugee professionals with opportunities that utilized their expertise. "How long did it take to develop these programs?" the coordinator asked, clearly impressed by the scope and sophistication of what she was seeing. 3 years of preparation, 3 days of implementation, Mary replied. The programming was fully designed and ready to launch as soon as institutional barriers were removed. The coordinator's report, filed later that week, identified Mary's work as a model for community integration programming that should be replicated in other locations. The Veterans Refugee Support Initiative received a substantial federal grant based on the demonstrated effectiveness of their approach, with Mary designated as the regional director responsible for expanding the model to neighboring communities. Thomas Hayes attended the program demonstration with quiet satisfaction, watching Mary coordinate activities with the kind of professional competence that made her dismissal seem like bureaucratic insanity. Her comfort level with complex logistics, her seamless movement between languages, her ability to facilitate interactions between diverse groups, all of it demonstrated expertise that had been wasted during her years of constrained employment. The tattoo meant something after all, he commented as they watched Mary moderate a discussion between Afghan women and local mothers about child-rearing practices in different cultures. "It always meant something," Mary replied. The community center board just couldn't see beyond their assumptions about what facility coordinators were supposed to be capable of. The transformation was complete by the end of the month. Mary's programs were operating in 3 locations. Her consultation services were in demand across the state, and her database of community needs and assets had become the foundation for regional integration planning. The small compass rose on her wrist had evolved from meaningless decoration to recognized symbol of expertise in community navigation and crisis response. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the phone call Mary received from Dr. Stevens 6 weeks after her firing. The community center was facing budget cuts due to poor evaluation scores, and the board was desperate to demonstrate the kind of effective programming that Mary had made routine. "We were wondering," Stevens said with obvious discomfort, "if You might consider a partnership arrangement. We provide facility space, you provide program expertise. Maybe we could find a way to work together that recognizes your particular qualifications. Mary's response was professional but firm. Dr. Stevens, I appreciate the offer, but my work now operates on a scale that goes far beyond single facility management. If the community center is interested in implementing effective integration programming, I'm happy to provide consultation services at my standard rate. And what would that involve? Stevens asked. It would involve recognizing that community development requires specialized expertise, cultural competency, and comprehensive preparation. It would involve treating refugee communities as assets rather than challenges, and it would involve hiring people based on their qualifications rather than your assumptions about what those qualifications should be. The conversation ended without agreement, but with clear understanding. Mary Bernard was no longer available to work within systems that couldn't recognize her expertise. She was now building systems that made such expertise the foundation for effective community service. The compass rose caught the afternoon light as she ended the call. Its simple lines representing navigation, guidance, and safe passage for people who needed help finding their way. For the first time in 3 years, Mary was using her family's symbol for exactly what it was designed to do, providing direction for people who deserved better than bureaucratic indifference disguised as professional procedure. 6 months after her firing from the Riverside Community Center, Mary Bernard stood before a packed auditorium at the State Community Development Conference, delivering the keynote address on effective integration, when expertise meets opportunity. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now being paid to teach other organizations the principles that her former employer had dismissed as overreach. The audience included community center directors, social service coordinators, and municipal officials from across the state, exactly the kind of people who'd been gatekeeping opportunities for qualified individuals like herself. But the success of Mary's programs had forced a reconsideration of what effective community development actually required. Integration isn't about providing space for parallel existence, Mary explained to the attentive crowd. It's about creating genuine connections that benefit everyone involved. When we moved beyond the assumption that refugees need help and recognized that they bring assets, everything changed. The data she presented was compelling. Communities implementing her model showed 340% increases in refugee employment placement, 280% improvements in cross-cultural programming attendance, and 95% reductions in crisis intervention needs. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real success was visible in the communities themselves. The Afghan engineer who'd struggled to communicate his wife's medical emergency was now teaching calculus at the local high school while completing his teaching certification. The Syrian women who'd sat isolated during pickup times were running a successful catering business that employed both refugee and local workers. The elderly book club members had expanded their group to include storytelling sessions, where community members shared narratives from their home countries. Thomas Hayes sat in the front row, watching Mary command the stage with the same quiet authority she'd shown during that first crisis 6 months ago. His own transformation had been nearly as dramatic as hers. Working with the Veteran Advocacy Network had given him purpose that helped process his military trauma while contributing meaningfully to civilian communities that reminded him of places he'd served overseas. The breakthrough moment, Mary continued, came when we stopped asking, what can we do for them? And started asking, what can we do together? Refugee communities aren't problems to be solved. They're resources to be utilized, perspectives to be valued, and partners to be engaged. The presentation included video testimonials from community members whose lives had been transformed by Mary's programs. An elderly Somali woman spoke about teaching traditional weaving techniques to local artists while learning digital photography from teenage volunteers. A young Afghan man described how his engineering background had helped design accessibility improvements for the community center while he studied for his professional licensing exams. These connections didn't happen accidentally, Mary emphasized. They required someone who understood both communities well enough to identify compatibility, someone who could navigate cultural differences that might create barriers, and someone who could facilitate initial interactions until relationships became self-sustaining. During the question and answer session, Patricia Hendrick stood up from the middle of the auditorium. Mary recognized her former supervisor immediately, though Patricia looked considerably less confident than she had during their last encounter. "Dr. Bernard," Patricia began, using Mary's newly completed PhD title with obvious reluctance, "your results are certainly impressive. But how do you address concerns about liability and professional boundaries when staff members operate outside their designated roles?" The question revealed that Patricia still didn't understand the fundamental issue. Mary's response was measured, but clear. The liability concern assumes that qualifications are determined by job titles rather than actual expertise. When properly qualified individuals are prevented from using their skills, the liability increases dramatically. My former position at Riverside demonstrated this, perfectly constraining my humanitarian aid background to facility management created exactly the kind of crisis that proper utilization of expertise would have prevented. The audience murmured with recognition. Many had experienced similar situations where bureaucratic boundaries had prevented effective responses to community needs. Furthermore, Mary continued, the question reveals a misunderstanding of what professional boundaries actually protect. They should prevent unqualified individuals from exceeding their competence, not prevent qualified individuals from using their expertise effectively. Dr. Stevens had accompanied Patricia to the conference, and he raised his hand with obvious discomfort. But how do organizations verify these kinds of qualifications? It's not always obvious when someone has specialized background that exceeds their current position. Mary's smile carried just a hint of the frustration she'd experienced during 3 years of having her qualifications dismissed. You ask. You review their actual background rather than making assumptions based on their current role. You recognize that overqualification is a resource, not a threat. The workshop sessions that followed the keynote allowed Mary to demonstrate the practical implementation of her programs. Attendees participated in the cultural exchange activities, experienced the crisis intervention protocols, and observed the skills inventory process that had transformed how refugee assets were identified and utilized. "This is what I don't understand," commented a community center director from a neighboring city. "These programs are clearly effective and professionally designed. Why wasn't this woman running community development instead of managing facilities?" Thomas answered from his position as workshop co-facilitator. "Because organizations often hire for comfort rather than competence. They'd rather employ someone whose limitations are familiar than someone whose capabilities might challenge existing assumptions." The conference concluded with Mary being offered consulting contracts by 14 different organizations, 3 permanent director positions, and an invitation to serve on the state's Community Integration Advisory Board. The transformation from invisible support staff to recognized expert was complete, but Mary's focus remained on the work itself rather than the recognition. That evening, at the conference reception, Mary found herself in conversation with the state's community development director, who'd been instrumental in promoting her programs as a statewide model. "I have to ask," the director said, "how does it feel to go from being fired for exceeding your authority to being invited to advise the entire state on community integration policy?" Mary touched the compass rose on her wrist, thinking about her grandmother Simone and all the people who'd carried on the family tradition of helping others navigate systems that weren't designed for their success. "It feels like I'm finally doing the work I was always supposed to be doing," she replied. "The only difference is that now I'm working with people who understand that expertise matters more than credentials, and that helping people requires recognizing what they're actually capable of contributing." The compass rose caught the reception hall lights, no longer a meaningless decoration, but a symbol of guidance that had found its proper purpose. Mary Bernard had proven that sometimes the most important qualifications are the ones that don't appear on organizational charts, and that the people most worth investing in are often the ones who've been systematically undervalued by institutions that couldn't see their potential clearly. Her success wasn't just personal vindication. It was proof that effective community development required exactly the kind of comprehensive expertise that she'd been quietly developing while others dismissed her as support staff. And for the hundreds of families whose lives had been improved by her programs, her transformation from overlooked coordinator to regional director meant the difference between isolation and integration, between surviving and thriving in communities that had finally learned to see their assets clearly. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after Mary Bernard had been fired from the Riverside Community Center. Patricia Hendrick's voice carried a tone Mary had never heard before, something between desperation and genuine humility that suggested the community center's situation had become critical. "Mary, Dr. Bernard, we need to discuss a partnership opportunity that might be mutually beneficial," Patricia began, her usual authoritative manner replaced by careful diplomacy. "The board has been reviewing our community impact metrics, and we're facing some significant challenges that your expertise might help us address." Mary listened with professional courtesy while reviewing the quarterly reports she'd been tracking on the community center's performance since her departure. The data painted a stark picture of institutional decline. Program attendance had dropped by 60%, state funding had been reduced due to poor integration outcomes, and community complaints about ineffective services had multiplied dramatically. "What kind of partnership did you have in mind?" Mary asked, though she suspected where the conversation was heading. "Well, the board has come to understand that your approach to community development represents best practices that we weren't previously aware of," Patricia continued, the admission clearly painful. "We're wondering if there might be a way to implement your programs at our facility, perhaps with you serving in a senior advisory capacity." The request represented a complete reversal of everything the board had stood for during Mary's employment. They were essentially asking her to return as the expert they'd refused to acknowledge she was, to implement the programs they'd dismissed as inappropriate overreach, and to serve the communities they'd claimed she wasn't qualified to understand. "I appreciate the offer," Mary replied, "but I'd need to understand what's changed about the board's perspective on community integration programming and the qualifications required to implement such programs effectively." Patricia's pause suggested she was consulting notes or conferring with others. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of institutional reckoning. "Dr. Stevens and I have both completed cultural competency training over the past 6, she said. "We've also reviewed best practices documentation from the State Community Development Office, which extensively references your work as a model for effective integration programming. We recognize that we may have been overly cautious about expanding programming beyond our traditional scope." Mary could hear the careful phrasing designed to avoid admitting that they'd been wrong about her qualifications while acknowledging that their approach had been inadequate. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic language that prioritized face saving over accountability. "Patricia," Mary said, using her former supervisor's first name for the first time in their professional relationship, "let me be direct about what effective partnership would require. It would mean acknowledging that community development requires specialized expertise that can't be constrained by arbitrary job descriptions. It would mean hiring and promoting based on actual qualifications rather than institutional comfort levels. And it would mean treating refugee communities as assets to be utilized, rather than problems to be managed. The silence that followed was lengthy. Mary could imagine the board members processing requirements that challenged everything about how they'd operated for years. "We're prepared to discuss significant modifications to our operational structure," Patricia finally replied. "The board has allocated funding for a new position, Director of Community Integration, that would have authority over all programming related to refugee services and cross-cultural initiatives." Mary's next question addressed the heart of them: institutional failures she'd experienced. And this position would report to whom? "Directly to the board," Patricia said, "with full autonomy over program development, staffing decisions, and resource allocation within the integration department." The offer represented everything Mary had needed 3 years ago when she'd taken the facility coordinator position, hoping to eventually move into community development work. But her circumstances had changed dramatically since then. She was now building programs across multiple locations, consulting with state-level policymakers, and developing training curricula for organizations nationwide. "Patricia, I need to be clear about my current situation," Mary said. "My work now operates on a regional scale. I'm coordinating programs in 15 communities, training staff in 30 organizations, and advising on policy development at the state level. Taking a single facility position would represent a significant reduction in scope and impact. What would it take to secure your involvement?" Patricia asked, her desperation becoming more evident. Mary had anticipated this conversation and had prepared a response that would serve multiple communities while addressing the Riverside Community Center's needs. "I could provide consultation services to help you implement effective programming, train your staff in best practices, and establish sustainable systems for ongoing community development. But I wouldn't be returning as an employee." The consultation arrangement that emerged from their negotiations included Mary designing comprehensive integration programs for the community center, training their staff in cultural competency and crisis intervention, and providing ongoing oversight to ensure proper implementation. The fees for these services exceeded what Mary's original salary had been by a factor of 4. More importantly, the contract required the community center to acknowledge Mary's expertise publicly, to implement programs based on her research and development, and to measure success using metrics that prioritize genuine community integration over bureaucratic compliance. The most satisfying element was the requirement that Patricia and Dr. Stevens complete the same cultural competency training that Mary had been pursuing independently during her years of constrained employment. They would learn firsthand about the specialized knowledge required for effective community development work, knowledge they'd dismissed as irrelevant when Mary had tried to apply it. Thomas Hayes attended the contract signing meeting as Mary's colleague and witness, watching the board members navigate the uncomfortable reality of hiring as a consultant the person they'd fired for exceeding her authority. His presence served as a reminder that Mary's transformation had been supported by people who recognized expertise when they saw it, rather than people who felt threatened by capabilities they didn't understand. "Dr. Bernard," Dr. Stevens said, during the contract discussion, "we want you to know that the board has gained significant appreciation for the complexity of community integration work. We understand now that we were operating with insufficient knowledge about best practices in this field." Mary's response was professional but pointed. "Dr. Stevens, the knowledge existed within your organization for 3 years. The issue wasn't access to information about best practices. It was willingness to recognize that your facility coordinator might possess expertise that exceeded your assumptions about her qualifications." The signed contract established Mary as the architect of the community center's transformation, but it also served as validation for every person whose qualifications had been dismissed by institutions that couldn't see beyond their preconceptions. Her success represented proof that competence would eventually be recognized, that expertise would find appropriate outlets, and that people committed to serving their communities would create opportunities when existing systems failed to provide. As Mary left the community center that day, she noticed the small memorial plaque that had been installed near the entrance, in recognition of emergency response excellence that saved lives through cultural competency and community service. The plaque didn't mention her by name, but everyone knew whose actions it commemorated. The compass rose on her wrist caught the afternoon sunlight as she walked to her car, no longer a symbol waiting for recognition, but a mark of guidance that had found its proper purpose. Mary Bernard had proven that sometimes the most important journey isn't about changing who you are. It's about finding people who can see clearly who you've always been. 2 years after being fired from the Riverside Community Center for exceeding her authority, Mary Bernard stood in the main hall of the same building, but everything had changed. The space buzzed with integrated programming that would have been unimaginable during her original employment. Afghan teenagers, tutoring local students in advanced mathematics while learning colloquial English. Somali women teaching traditional crafts to art therapy groups. Syrian engineers mentoring high school robotics teams while completing their professional certifications. The transformation was so complete that visitors often couldn't identify which community members were refugees and which were longtime residents. Exactly the kind of seamless integration that Mary had envisioned during her years of suppressed advocacy. The careful segregation that had once defined the center's operations had been replaced by authentic collaboration that benefited everyone involved. Mary moved through the activities with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose vision had become reality, but her role had evolved far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. She now directed community integration programs across 3 states, consulted with federal agencies on refugee policy development, and trained organizational leaders in recognizing and utilizing expertise that didn't fit conventional assumptions. About qualifications. The afternoon brought a special celebration, the official dedication of the center's new Community Navigation Resource Center, funded by a federal grant that specifically cited Mary's work as justification for expanded integration. Programming. The dedication ceremony would be attended by state officials, community leaders, and families whose lives had been transformed by the programs Mary had developed. Thomas Hayes arrived early for the ceremony, his own transformation evident in his role as regional coordinator for veteran refugee community partnerships. Working with Mary's programs had given him purpose that helped process his military trauma while contributing meaningfully to communities that reminded him of places he'd served overseas. Their partnership had created programming that addressed both veteran transition challenges and refugee integration needs, recognizing that both populations understood something about navigation and resilience that could benefit broader communities. "Hard to believe this is the same place that fired you for being too competent," Thomas commented as they watched teenagers from 4 different countries collaborating on a community garden project that supplied fresh vegetables for both the center's programming and local food assistance programs. "It's not the same place," Mary replied. "The building is the same, but everything else changed when people started recognizing assets instead of just seeing problems." The ceremony began with remarks from the state's community development director, who'd become one of Mary's strongest advocates after witnessing the effectiveness of her programs. "Dr. Bernard's work represents a fundamental shift in how we approach community integration," the director explained to the assembled crowd. "Instead of asking what we can do for refugee communities, she taught us to ask what we can accomplish together." Patricia Hendricks, now serving as the center's facilities director under the restructured organization, introduced Mary with words that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. "Dr. Bernard transformed our understanding of what community development actually requires." Her expertise in humanitarian aid, cultural competency, And crisis intervention created programming that serves as a model for organizations nationwide. The recognition was gratifying, but Mary's focus remained on the families whose lives had been improved by the changes. During her remarks, she acknowledged the community members who trusted her informal support during her years of constrained employment, who'd shared their stories and challenges with someone who couldn't officially help them, but who cared enough to listen and prepare for the opportunity to serve them properly. Community integration isn't about changing who people are, Mary explained to the audience. It's about creating spaces where everyone can contribute their best capabilities while learning from others. When we moved beyond assumptions about who belonged in which roles, we discovered resources we didn't know existed. The most meaningful moment came when Amira Hassan, the Syrian mother whose diabetic son Mary had helped during that first medical crisis, presented Mary with a traditional compass rose embroidered on silk. The design perfectly matched Mary's tattoo, but included additional elements representing the journeys of all the families who'd found safe passage through Mary's programs. "You helped us navigate when we were lost," Amira said and carefully practiced English. "Now we help others find their way, just like you taught us." The gift represented the completion of the cycle that had begun with Mary's grandmother in the French Resistance, continued through Mary's humanitarian aid work, and now extended to communities that were creating their own networks of guidance and support. The compass rose had evolved from family symbol to community emblem, representing navigation and safe passage for anyone who needed help finding their direction. Dr. Stevens, who'd completed the cultural competency training that Mary had required, acknowledged his own institutional learning during the ceremony. "We thought community development meant managing resources and maintaining facilities. Dr. Bernard showed us that it means recognizing human potential and creating opportunities for mutual support." The transformation extended beyond individual recognition to systemic change. The community center now served as a training site for other organizations learning to implement effective integration programming. Mary's database of community assets and needs had become a model replicated in dozens of cities. Her crisis intervention protocols were being adopted by emergency response systems that had learned to value cultural competency as a core professional skill. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the center hired and promoted staff. Qualifications were now assessed based on actual expertise rather than assumptions about what certain positions required. The organization actively recruited people with humanitarian backgrounds, language skills, and cultural competency, recognizing that these capabilities were essential for serving diverse communities effectively. As the ceremony concluded and Mary moved through conversations with community members, state officials, and organizational leaders who'd come to learn from her programs, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The invisible support staff who'd been dismissed for caring too much had become a recognized expert whose work was transforming how communities understood integration and mutual support. Thomas joined her near the memorial plaque that commemorated her emergency response work, the incident that had cost her one job, but revealed the expertise that created far greater opportunities. "Any regrets about how things worked out?" he asked. Mary touched the compass rose on her wrist, thinking about her grandmother, Simone, and all the people who'd carried on the family tradition of helping others navigate difficult territory. The simple tattoo had become a symbol recognized throughout the refugee community, marking someone who could be trusted to provide guidance when official channels failed or proved inadequate. "No regrets," she replied. "Getting fired was the best thing that could have happened. It forced me to stop asking permission to do work that needed to be done and start building systems that made such work possible." The late afternoon sun streamed through the center's windows, illuminating spaces where authentic community had replaced careful segregation, where expertise was valued regardless of its source, and where people were recognized for what they could contribute rather than limited by others' assumptions about their capabilities. Mary Bernard, had proven that sometimes the most meaningful transformation isn't about changing who you are. It's about finding or creating environments where who you are can be properly valued and effectively utilized. Her compass rose tattoo had indeed meant nothing to most people, until circumstances revealed that the guidance it represented was exactly what a community needed to find its way towards something better than anyone had imagined possible. The work continued, but now it continued with proper recognition, adequate resources, and institutional support for the kind of comprehensive expertise that effective community development actually required. And for Mary, that transformation from overlooked coordinator to regional director meant that her family's tradition of helping people find safe passage could continue on a scale that honored both her grandmother's resistance work and her own commitment to serving communities that deserved better than bureaucratic indifference disguised as professional procedure. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.